Hello students, welcome to our continued discussion of Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. This discussion will cover part number 7. So just as a quick reminder, part number 6 talked a lot about housing policies and the way in which concepts of segregation and exploitation were really embedded into a post-World War II, especially post-World War II environment. How there was acts of legal discrimination to keep African Americans from having the ability to purchase or rent in white neighborhoods. And then if that failed, they would result to terroristic violence to keep them out. And then finally, as both of those became less effective as the march of history came on, it resulted in white flight, where people would just leave. As opposed to living in a diverse neighborhood, they would move out to a suburb or a neighborhood farther out of an urban area so that they could maintain a sort of segregated approach to housing. So if that's part 6, part 7 then wants to discuss this idea again and continue the discussion of segregation of housing and how there was a whole range of housing issues when it came to, African Americans. So one of the first examples Coates gives you in part 7 is this idea of blockbusting, right? So Coates describes blockbusting as a tactic where a real estate developer would use the fear of integration to then buy land on the cheap. He gives the example of how they might hire a African-American woman to push a baby stroller around the neighborhood to hint that maybe an African-American family had moved in or thinking to move in, and which they would then come in and buy the houses on the cheap in this neighborhood and then sell them to African Americans, creating that system of on-contract buying that we find discussed in other parts of his essay. So blockbusting was sort of the first step on a way to create unfair and exploitative housing conditions. It's also an example, though not exactly stated, of how Coates describes that this system of racist and segregated housing policies did also hurt other white people. They were getting robbed of their house value just as much in the tactic of block building. Right? They were victims as well, although granted, not nearly as much as African Americans would under the system. So if blockbusting describes the unfair example, it gives you a historical piece of data and evidence about the way that African Americans were treated unfairly by an exploitive housing system and shady real estate developers. The interviews with Mattie Lewis and Ethel Weatherspoon provide you a personal, detailed look at how the cost of all of these things affected real people. Always remember that we've talked about how Coates uses 3 main tactics to convince you of his point throughout this essay. One being historical data, notes of historical examples like blockbusting. 2, interviews with people. All right, and this would be an example of this second one, the interview with people. And then, of course, he uses a bunch of data and statistics. So examples, interviews, and statistics. So this would be an interview that he uses with these 2 women. And the main thing that they discuss is these 2 women were able to keep their homes in the unfair practice of on-contract buying. So Coates asks them, how were you able to do this with a system that was so skewed against you, where you had limited freedom and limited access? How were you able to sacrifice and keep your homes and not fall prey to this? And Lewis and Weatherspoon, in an almost understated matter-of-fact statement, talk about how they just essentially cut everything down to the bone to keep making their housing payments. Witherspoon states, you cut down on the light bill, you cut down on your food bill, right? They cut everything down to keep making the payments. This also included cutting down on things their children would have wanted, opportunities for their children to have a better life than they did. Those were also sacrificed, all in order to keep this house. So the interview with Lewis And Weatherspoon is Coates putting a human face on the sacrifices that these people, just like Clyde Ross describes in other parts of the essay, the sacrifices they did to keep their homes, sacrifices that they did not have to do and that they should not have needed to do, but sacrifices they faced as African Americans due to the exploitative nature of on-contract buying and other housing systems. So the interview here is really designed to allow you as the reader to put a human face to the quiet plunder he describes in Chapter 5. Weatherspoon and Lewis talk about cutting down on light bills, cutting down on food bills, cutting down on things their children wanted. Not just because they may have been working class, but because they were exploited as working class African Americans. They had to make sacrifices that comparable people who would not have been black wouldn't have had to make. And that is Coates' point, that their sacrifice that they did was one that was unnecessary and imposed on them in particular because of the on-contract buying practices that exploited African Americans. So now we get to the subtitle of Part 7. A lot of people fell by the way. So this continues the theme and really cements the theme that the exploitation of African Americans described almost a lost generation, right? That the conditions under which African Americans left meant that many people were suffered and lost. So in the essay that you're reading, you meet Clyde Ross and Lewis and Weatherspoon. Coates reflects that these are the exceptional advantages. These were people who, through a combination of luck and their own ability and their own talents, were able to come out of this exploitive system of on-contract buying and keep their homes. But he said these are exceptional, that these are the stories we hear of the survivors of this, whereas the stories we don't hear, all right, the people who fell by the way of this system, we don't know how many stories of those are. So, as he says, he reflects on his own process of doing these interviews, that he, while researching this essay, was only seeing part of the picture, the tiny minority who'd managed to hold on to their homes. But for all our exceptional ones, for every Ethel Weatherspoon or Clyde Ross, for every black survivor, there are so many thousands gone. So for all of the exceptional people he discusses in the essay who managed to make it through this exploitative system, he wants you to remember that this is just the tip of an iceberg, and that what we don't see are the thousands of people who lost their homes, who lost everything, who may have lost family members, who may not have been able to pay for medical treatments, who may have become homeless or suffered terroristic violence and were murdered or lived their life in fear in other places. We don't hear their stories because they were the people who fell by the way of a system designed to exploit them. So this is a key part. A lot of people fell by the way. Is him saying that in terms of the larger structure of the case for reparations, we must understand that unearthing these damages done systematically through American history, that we must remember that there are real people and that he can't interview them like Clyde Ross and Ethel Weatherspoon, because for every survivor, there are those who didn't survive.